The last video in this series established a specific argument that China's dominance over critical mineral processing is not a market condition. It is a strategic instrument, deliberately constructed over 3 decades and already activated twice, in 2010 against Japan and in 2023 against the broader Western technology sector. The mechanism is the processing layer, not the ore in the ground, and the leverage it creates is structural, not episodic. That argument raises an immediate question. If the problem is structural, what does a structural response actually look like? Not the policy announcements. Those have been plentiful since 2010. The operational reality. What are the states most exposed to this leverage actually doing? How consistent is their strategy, and where does it break down? That is what this video examines. 3 cases, 3 different strategic responses to the same underlying problem, and a synthesis that explains why the challenge of breaking mineral dependence is more analytically interesting and more difficult than most coverage suggests. To understand why these 3 cases matter, it helps to be precise about what kind of problem mineral dependence actually is. It is not primarily a supply problem. Most of the minerals at issue, lithium, cobalt, nickel, rare earth elements, exist in commercially viable concentrations across multiple continents. Australia has them. Indonesia has them. Canada has them. The United States has them. The problem is the processing gap, the distance between ore in the ground and refined material ready for industrial use. China controls roughly 60 to 90% of global processing capacity across the most strategically consequential mineral categories. The ore can be mined anywhere. The transformation into usable input happens overwhelmingly in China. This matters because what defense systems, electric vehicles, semiconductors, and advanced manufacturing require is not ore. It is processed material, finished to precise industrial specifications, delivered reliably at scale. The choke point is the processing infrastructure, and that infrastructure took 3 decades to build and concentrate. It cannot be replicated in 3 years, regardless of the financing committed or the political will expressed. The states navigating this problem are therefore not asking a simple question. Where do we find more minerals? They are asking a genuinely hard question. How do we reconstruct an industrial ecosystem that was allowed to atrophy over 30 years while managing the economic and strategic costs of dependence in the meantime? That is a different category of problem, and the 3 cases that follow illustrate 3 genuinely different answers to it. Australia's position in the critical mineral story is structurally paradoxical in a way worth stating directly. It is one of the world's most resource-endowed countries. Significant deposits of lithium, cobalt, rare earths, nickel, and the iron ore that underpins Chinese steel production. It is also one of the countries most directly exposed to the strategic consequences of Chinese mineral leverage, having experienced between 2020 and 2023 a sustained Chinese economic coercion campaign targeting its agricultural exports in response to Australian foreign policy positions that Beijing found objectionable. The Australian experience of that coercion campaign is analytically instructive precisely because it did not break the Australian government's strategic posture. Canberra absorbed the trade restrictions, diversified export markets with varying degrees of success, and ultimately signed the AUKUS agreement in 2021, committing to the deepest security integration with the United States and United Kingdom that Australia had accepted since the Second World War. The coercion backfired, in the narrow sense that it did not produce the behavioral modification Beijing intended. But understanding why it backfired is more important than the fact that it did. Australia's capacity to resist was not primarily a function of political will, though that mattered. It was a function of leverage. China could restrict Australian barley, wine, coal, and beef, and did. What it could not restrict was Australian iron ore, because Chinese steel production has no alternative supplier at comparable scale and price. The coercion was real and economically significant. But the one Australian export that China structurally required was the one that could not be weaponized against Canberra without imposing prohibitive costs on Beijing itself. This tells us something important about the conditions under which middle powers can resist mineral leverage. They need their own leverage in return. Australia has it unusually because its iron ore exports give it structural economic importance to China that most middle powers do not possess. The resistance strategy that worked for Australia is therefore not universally replicable. Australia's proactive response to the mineral dimension of this problem has been the critical minerals strategy, combined with deeper integration into Western-aligned supply chain frameworks. The Mineral Security Partnership with the United States, Japan, Canada, and European partners, and progressive investment in domestic processing capability. The strategic logic is straightforward. Australia has the ore. What it historically lacked was the processing infrastructure, which predominantly ran through China. Building that processing layer domestically or within allied supply chains is the core objective. The execution gap is significant. Building processing facilities for lithium, cobalt, or rare earths requires sustained capital investment, years of environmental permitting, and technical expertise that Australia is still in the process of reconstructing. The commitments have been real. The operational timelines are long, and the intermediate period between strategic commitment and operational processing capacity is precisely the window during which Australia remains dependent on the infrastructure it is trying to replace. The selective alignment trajectory that AUKUS represents has narrowed Australia's strategic flexibility in ways that are worth noting. A state that has committed to nuclear-powered submarine cooperation with the United States and United Kingdom, hardware designed specifically for the operational environment of a potential Western Pacific contingency, has made a strategic choice whose implications extend well beyond the mineral domain. Australia is moving toward a posture of deep alignment with the American-led security architecture, while attempting to preserve sufficient economic independence in specific domains, most critically iron ore, to prevent that alignment from creating catastrophic exposure in the event of a genuine U.S.-China confrontation. Whether that balance is sustainable is one of the defining strategic questions of Australian foreign policy over the coming decade. Indonesia's position in the critical mineral competition is analytically distinct from Australia's in a way that reshapes the strategic calculation entirely. Where Australia is primarily an exporter of raw mineral inputs seeking to add processing value, Indonesia has pursued a different and, in some ways, more ambitious approach. It has attempted to use its position as the world's largest nickel producer to capture processing value domestically by restricting ore exports and compelling investment in Indonesian processing infrastructure. The nickel ore export ban, progressively implemented from 2020 onward, is the clearest example of this strategy in operation. Indonesia did not simply allow Chinese companies, which were the primary buyers of Indonesian nickel ore and the primary investors in Indonesian nickel processing, to continue extracting value from the processing layer. It restricted the ore export and demanded that processing happen onshore. The result has been a significant expansion of Indonesian nickel processing capacity, substantial Chinese investment in that capacity, and the emergence of Indonesia as a meaningful player in the battery supply chain rather than simply a raw material provider. This is a genuine strategic achievement, and it is worth recognizing as such. Indonesia is one of the few middle powers that has demonstrably shifted its position in the mineral supply chain from raw material exporter toward processed material supplier, which is precisely the movement that most Western policy frameworks advocate, but few states have executed with comparable consistency. The complications are structural, and they illustrate the limits of the strategy with equal clarity. The processing capacity that has been built in Indonesia is overwhelmingly Chinese-owned and Chinese-operated. Indonesian policy has succeeded in relocating the processing geography. The smelters and refineries are now in Indonesia rather than China, but the ownership and the technical expertise remain concentrated in Chinese industrial actors. This is not valueless. It generates Indonesian employment, tax revenue, and infrastructure development. But it does not produce the kind of supply chain independence that Western critical mineral strategies are seeking. From the perspective of a Western government attempting to reduce dependence on Chinese-controlled mineral processing, Indonesian nickel processed by Chinese-owned facilities in Indonesian territory is not a meaningfully independent alternative. The processing choke point has been geographically relocated without being structurally diversified. Indonesia's response to Western pressure for deeper supply chain integration reflects the hedging logic that has governed Indonesian foreign policy for 7 decades. Jakarta has engaged with Western critical mineral frameworks without committing to exclusive alignment with them. It has accepted some American and Japanese investment in its processing sector while maintaining the dominant Chinese industrial presence. It has used the competition between Western and Chinese suitors to extract better terms from each without foreclosing the other. This posture works as long as both sets of suitors need something Indonesia can provide, and as long as the competition between them remains active enough that neither can afford to walk away from the relationship. Indonesia's nickel leverage is genuine and durable. The reserves are large, the processing infrastructure is real, and the battery supply chain's demand for nickel is growing. The structural question is whether the hedging architecture is building genuine Indonesian industrial capacity and technical expertise, or whether it is producing a more geographically distributed version of the same dependency that existed before the export ban. The honest answer at this stage of the process is uncertain, and that uncertainty is itself an important analytical finding. Indonesia's strategy is the most sophisticated attempt by any middle power to use mineral resource leverage to reposition itself structurally in the global supply chain. Whether it succeeds in building durable industrial capacity or merely relocates and diversifies the ownership of dependence without eliminating it, will take another decade to assess with confidence. India's position in the critical minerals story is the most complicated of the 3 cases, and the complication is instructive precisely because it reflects a broader pattern in Indian strategic behavior that the country's foreign policy tradition makes structurally predictable. India's mineral endowment is substantial but uneven. It has significant coal, iron ore, and bauxite deposits, but its reserves of the minerals most critical to the energy transition and advanced technology supply chains, lithium, cobalt, and rare earth elements, are either limited or inadequately surveyed and developed. India is therefore simultaneously a potential middle player in critical mineral supply chains and a significant consumer whose manufacturing ambitions for electric vehicles, electronics, and defense systems create mineral dependencies that its domestic reserves cannot fully satisfy. India's strategic response to this situation reflects the broader doctrine of strategic autonomy that has governed Indian foreign policy since independence. The attempt to maintain meaningful relationships with all major powers simultaneously, extracting resources and technology from each without submitting to the exclusive alignment that any single relationship would require. On critical minerals specifically, this has produced an active engagement with multiple supply chain frameworks, deepening cooperation with the United States through the Minerals Security Partnership and bilateral technology agreements, pursuing mineral exploration and processing partnerships in Africa and Australia, and maintaining the economic relationship with China that Indian manufacturing supply chains continue to require. The India-US Critical Mineral Agreement signed in 2025, which was generating significant attention at the time this video was being produced, is the most recent and visible expression of this strategy. The agreement reflects genuine strategic complementarity. The United States needs alternative sources of processed rare earth and critical mineral inputs. India needs capital, technology, and market access for a processing sector it is attempting to build. The alignment of interests is real. The execution challenge is equally real, and it reflects the pattern that appears repeatedly in India's strategic autonomy tradition: the gap between the political aspiration and the operational achievement. India's domestic mining and processing sector faces significant structural constraints: regulatory complexity that slows permitting and investment, infrastructure deficits that raise production costs, and a technical capacity gap that requires sustained investment to close. The trajectory is positive, but the pace is slow relative to both India's stated ambitions and the urgency that Western supply chain strategies require. India's attempt to leverage its strategic autonomy position in the mineral domain to be a significant alternative supplier without becoming captured by either the American or Chinese supply chain architecture is strategically coherent and genuinely valuable if it can be executed. A large, credible, non-aligned mineral processing partner with genuine industrial capacity would significantly reduce Western dependence on Chinese processing without requiring the explicit strategic alignment that a formal alliance would entail. That is a position worth substantial Western investment. Whether India can deliver it on the timelines that supply chain diversification requires is a different question. And the honest answer is that it depends on execution capacity that India has historically found more difficult to generate than its strategic ambitions require. The vision is sound. The institutional architecture for realizing it is still under construction. 3 cases, 3 different strategic responses. What does the pattern reveal? The first observation is that middle power mineral strategy is not primarily a story about resources. Australia, Indonesia, and India all have resources. The strategic challenge for each is the same challenge that this series has argued defines the entire critical mineral competition: the processing layer. Control of processing is where the leverage lives, and the 3 cases illustrate 3 different theories of how to reconstruct or reposition within that layer. Australia's theory is alignment: build processing capacity within a Western-aligned supply chain framework, accept deeper security integration as the political cost of that alignment, and leverage genuine resource endowments to maintain bargaining power during the transition. Indonesia's theory is resource nationalism applied to the processing stage: restrict ore exports, attract investment in domestic processing, and hedge between competing great powers to maximize the terms of that investment. India's theory is strategic autonomy: maintain multiple relationships, leverage geopolitical significance to attract investment from competing suitors, and attempt to build domestic processing capacity without sacrificing the foreign policy independence that Indian strategic culture treats as non-negotiable. The second observation is about the structural ceiling that all 3 approaches encounter. None of them, at current pace and scale, is producing a processing sector that genuinely competes with Chinese capacity on the dimensions that matter most for Western supply chain security: cost, volume, reliability, and the depth of technical expertise that 3 decades of industrial development have produced. The commitments are real. The investments are increasing. The execution timelines are long. The institutional obstacles are significant, and the gap between what governments announce and what processing infrastructure can actually deliver within any given strategic planning cycle remains substantial. This is not a reason for pessimism about the long-term trajectory. It is a reason for precision about what the medium-term reality looks like. The diversification of critical mineral supply chains is a decades-long project. The strategic window in which Western governments have the political will and financial commitment to sustain that project against domestic economic pressures, electoral cycles, and the constant temptation to resume cheaper relationships with existing suppliers is uncertain. The states that understand both the genuine progress being made and the genuine gap that remains are better positioned to assess the strategic picture than those who interpret policy announcements as operational achievements. The third observation, and perhaps the most important one for understanding where this competition is heading, concerns the asymmetry that the previous video in this series identified. China's position in critical mineral processing was built over 3 decades through sustained strategic patience and institutional coherence across multiple governments. The Western response, including these 3 middle power strategies, has been running seriously for perhaps 5 years, with varying degrees of consistency across political transitions. Closing that gap requires not just investment and political will in any single government's term, but the kind of sustained institutional commitment that Western democracies have found structurally difficult to maintain. Whether that commitment can be sustained, and whether middle powers like Australia, Indonesia, and India can maintain sufficient strategic coherence through their own political transitions to contribute meaningfully to the diversification project, is the open question that the next decade will answer. If the framework in this video raised questions you want to pursue further, on how middle powers navigate great power competition more broadly, on the specific strategies of hedging, selective alignment, and strategic autonomy that structure the cases examined here, that argument is developed in full in the Middle Power Playbook, which is the 5th book in the Anatomy of Power series. The critical mineral dimension, specifically, the structural analysis of how mineral dependencies get constructed and what they mean for alliance politics, is covered in depth in The Elements of Power and the Mineral State, the 2nd and 3rd books in the Critical Materials series. All 3 are linked in the description. The next video in this series moves from the supply side to the demand side, what the states most dependent on Chinese mineral processing are actually doing to reduce that dependence, and what the record of Western government commitments on this issue, measured against operational outcomes rather than announced intentions, actually shows. The execution gap is the subject, and it is a larger story than most coverage suggests.